Imagine the responsibility of a pilot flying an aircraft that's hundreds of thousands of times larger than a regular car. How complicated can the landing process be for such a behemoth? And if unexpected circumstances arise during flight or landing, pilots have to react in a flash to avoid disaster. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. Today, I've put together the most incredible aviation moments caught on camera. Are you ready? Let's go! In early autumn of 2010, a plane flying from the Siberian city of Yakutsk to Moscow faced a very serious problem. On board the Tu-154, there was a complete loss of power 3.5 hours after takeoff. The plane was at a significant altitude when suddenly everything stopped working. To work, not only the navigation equipment but also the fuel supply systems to the engines. The fuel that had made it to the turbines could only keep the engines running for about 30 minutes. Beneath them stretched the endless expanses of the taida, where for hundreds of miles around there was nothing but forests and wild animals. However, the crew didn't lose their composure. The pilots began their descent to an altitude of 9,842 feet to try to find a suitable place for an emergency landing. Fortunately, the weather remained relatively calm, although the sky was overcast. To track the plane, the pilots used a glass of water. They could tell if the aircraft was level. They chose a village airfield. They determined if the machine was level. The runway was half the needed length for the Tu-154. The airfield was abandoned, used only for helicopters. Despite this, pilots landed the plane without navigation equipment. Moreover, the airfield had long been abandoned and was used exclusively for helicopters. Despite this, the pilots successfully landed the plane without the help of navigation equipment. The plane hit low fir trees, slowing it. All were unharmed. The plane crashed into some trees, but they turned out to be low firs that didn't cause significant damage to the fuselage and even helped slow the aircraft down. All the passengers were unharmed. On April 29, 2013, in Afghanistan, a dashcam captured the catastrophic crash of an American cargo plane, a Boeing 747. The cause of the accident was completely absurd circumstances. During takeoff, an armored vehicle came loose from its mount inside the plane, which damaged the pressure bulkhead, the hydraulic system, and bent the screw jacks of both horizontal stabilizers. As a result, the plane went into a tailspin and crashed to the ground just a few seconds after takeoff, exploding on impact. All 7 crew members on board lost their lives. After this tragedy, Boeing implemented stricter cargo securing regulations. In 2011, a passenger plane from the Polish airline lot was on a route from New York to Warsaw. The entire flight went without any incidents. It wasn't until the very end of the journey that it became clear that none of the landing gear could be deployed. The pilots had to make the decision to land the plane on its metal fuselage. To minimize the risk of fire and at the same time reduce the weight of the aircraft, the pilots spent an hour circling over Warsaw. However, the key moment remained the landing itself. The plane needed to be landed. So, in order to evenly distribute the load across the entire underside of the fuselage. Fortunately, the pilot's skills were top-notch. They managed to perfectly calculate the moment of contact, the speed, and lower the car as smoothly as possible. One can only imagine the noise in the cabin as the multi-ton aircraft slid along the asphalt. But the main thing is, none of the 230 passengers were injured. The worst tragedy at an airshow happened in Ukraine near Lviv at the Sknyliv airfield on July 27, 2002. During a complex maneuver, a Su-27 fighter jet crashed right into the crowd of spectators. As a result of the disaster, 77 people lost their lives, including 28 children. During a complex maneuver, a Su-27 fighter jet crashed right into the crowd of spectators. As a result of the disaster, 77 people lost their lives, including 28 children. Another 543 people were injured to varying degrees. The main cause of the tragedy was identified as the crew's deviation from the assigned route and a mistake in controlling the aircraft. Both pilots managed to eject, but they were later convicted of negligence. The captain was sentenced to 14 years in prison, although he was released early after 11 years. The co-pilot was sentenced to 8 years in prison but was released after 2.5 years. Dushenko Gerald flew with a cat in her handbag. The crew found it and put it in an empty restroom. In her handbag, there was a cap that she was trying to sneak on board. After takeoff and climbing to altitude, the crew discovered the animal, and since there wasn't a suitable container available, they temporarily placed the cat in an empty restroom. It seemed like the situation was resolved. But that wasn't the end of it. It turned out that Gerald had a bit of a temper. She caused a scene right during the flight. The girl wasn't just demanding her cat back, she was threatening to destroy the airliner, claiming she had connections to the mafia. The crew had to take this threat seriously. As a result, 2 fighters took off from a nearby military base. They caught up with the passenger plane and escorted it to Denver, where it made an emergency but smooth landing. When the Herald was handed over to the FBI, it turned out that all her threats were a bluff. She has no connections to the mafia at all. She definitely wasn't planning to harm anyone. She just wanted to get her pet back. What do you think? Did Gerald deserve punishment for her actions? Share your thoughts in the comments. This tragic accident happened in Taiwan in 2015. 37 seconds after takeoff, the ATR-72 plane experienced a fire in one of its engines. The pilots tried to immediately shut down the faulty engine, but they made a mistake and turned off the working motor. As a result, the plane started to tilt. He clipped a taxi with his wing and damaged the guardrail of the overpass, after which he fell into the river. Rescue teams reached the crash site in inflatable boats within 35 minutes. They evacuated the survivors from the tail section of the plane, and they were taken to shore. Out of the 58 people on board, only 15 survived. 14 passengers and 1 flight attendant. The taxi drivers on the bridge also sustained injuries. In 2013, a small plane had a botched landing in Iceland. The crash claimed the lives of 2 passengers, but the pilot, against all odds, survived. In West Virginia, during an airshow, 2 planes collided in midair, and one of them crashed and exploded. The pilot died. A similar incident happened many years ago in Malta. During an airshow, one plane clipped and broke the tail of another, causing it to lose control and crash into the water. The pilot died on the spot. Overall, I'd recommend staying away from airshows because there have been quite a few accidents at these events. For example, a terrible accident happened during an airshow in Madrid. The jet crashed, and the pilot died from severe burns. Another 8 people were injured. And here are some clips from the airshow in Toronto. The spectators were at a safe distance, and fortunately, no one was hurt. The Boeing 777 was barely holding its balance while landing at Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands, swaying from side to side. Gaining altitude and waiting for better weather conditions wasn't an option, so the pilots had to land the plane urgently. When the plane touched down, the strong gusty wind was literally tossing it from one landing gear to the other. However, despite the challenges, the pilots managed to keep their balance, avoiding an accident, and no one was hurt. An even more complicated situation arose during the landing at Wellington Airport. The strong wind was making it tough for the heavy airliner, so the pilots had to repeatedly lift the plane into the air because the hurricane was literally tossing the aircraft around and wouldn't let it slow down. It was only on the 3rd attempt that they managed to stop the plane. In fact, such windy conditions are a common occurrence for this region of New Zealand. You can only feel sympathy for the pilots flying in that area. In 2008, a Lufthansa plane got caught in a tropical cyclone. Emma, who was uprooting big trees, tore off the roofs of buildings and overturned cars. As a result, the short flight from Munich to Hamburg turned into something more than any round-the-world trip. During the landing, the hurricane sweeping across Europe was rocking the plane so violently that it was scraping its wings against the runway, creating sparks. During the landing, the hurricane sweeping across Europe was rocking the plane so violently that it was scraping its wings against the runway, creating sparks. The plane was sliding and swerving from side to side. The plane almost went off the runway. The pilot had to pull the plane up, make a circle, and try to land again with a damaged wing. Fortunately, the pilot was able to slow down in time, and no one was hurt. Why don't pilots just wait for the weather to get better? Because fuel supplies are constantly running low, and the hurricane can only get stronger. Pilots Jeremy Zwart and Lachlan Smale knew this very well when they tried to land the Airbus A303-2 at Sydney Airport. A storm hit the city, and the pilots had to fly right through the heart of the storm front. Most of the planes in the skies above the city left, requesting emergency landings in nearby populated areas. However, the pilots of that flight, Jeremy Zwart and Lachlan Smale, noticed a tiny break in the clouds. This little patch of clear sky was small, but it provided just enough light to control the plane. Amazingly, the experience and skill of the pilots allowed them to steer the Airbus out of the very center of the hurricane, to control the plane. Incredibly, the experience and skill of the pilots allowed them to steer the Airbus out of the very center of the hurricane. The plane was successfully landed with no injuries. The film Miracle on the Hudson is based on real events that took place in 2009. That's when Captain Chesley Sullenberger performed a true miracle that saved the lives of hundreds of people. Almost immediately after taking off from LaGuardia Airport, the Airbus A320 collided with a flock of wild geese, which, in trying to get away from the plane, got caught in the engines and took them out. Without working engines, returning to the airport or reaching the nearest airfield became impossible. Given the low altitude, the chances of a successful landing were minimal. The captain decided to take the extreme measure of making an emergency landing on the Hudson River right in the heart of New York City. In such a critical situation, even the slightest mistake could lead to the loss of many lives. The crew was risking not only their own lives and the lives of the passengers, but also the safety of thousands of residents in Manhattan, watching the events unfold from the shore. However, thanks to Captain Sullenberger's professionalism, the landing went flawlessly, and all the passengers survived. Rescue teams quickly arrived at the scene and began evacuating people right off the wings of the sinking plane. In 2017, Ukrainian pilot Alexander Akapov showcased incredible skill by landing a plane at Istanbul Airport. Basically, blind. During the flight, hail shattered the cockpit windows, leaving them completely covered in cracks. Complete loss of visibility. The nose of the plane turned into one big dent. Despite that, pilot Alexander Akapov was able to land the plane using the only undamaged side window. Thanks to his actions, 121 passengers and the entire crew were saved. After the successful landing, colleagues came up to thank the hero who had accomplished the task. It seemed almost impossible. In 1996, a Boeing 767 was hijacked by 3 terrorists who were demanding political asylum in Australia. On the way to its destination, the airliner made an emergency landing in the Indian Ocean, just 1,500 feet from Grand Comoro Island, because it ran out of fuel. After landing, the plane broke apart and sank. Out of the 175 people on board, 125 died, including all 3 hijackers. In December 1991, a McDonnell Douglas MD-81 was on a flight from Copenhagen to Warsaw with a stopover in Stockholm. The problem started a minute and a half after takeoff when both engines failed. The captain tried to turn the plane back to the airport, but the altitude was too low. A second pilot helped deploy flaps, slowing the plane. The landing was rough. He helped with the equipment, and at an altitude of about 1,148 feet, just seconds before hitting the ground, they managed to fully deploy the flaps, which helped slow the plane down. The landing was going to be extremely rough and dramatic, as it had to be made in a wooded area. At a speed of about 124 miles per hour, the plane took out several trees. The impact tore off a wing, and the plane sharply turned to the right, but it didn't have time to spin, and, in a moment, it fell onto the edge of the clearing. The inertia pulled it 360 feet across the ground. From such massive overloads, the aircraft's fuselage split into 3 pieces. Fuel started leaking from the fuel tanks. Fortunately, there were no sparks, no fire, and no explosion. Moreover, despite the rough landing, the torn-off wing, and the destruction of the fuselage, all 129 people on board survived. Flying is safer than driving. Fewer than 150,000 deaths in aviation, far less than monthly traffic deaths. Throughout the history of civil aviation, fewer than 150,000 people have died. This number is significantly lower than the number of fatalities and traffic accidents every month around the world. So, the fear of flying is unfounded. And now, friends, I want to make you a very interesting offer. You have a unique opportunity to become part of our team. If you have video editing skills, can voice over videos in Russian, English, and other languages, or if you write interesting scripts, we would be happy to work with you. Message our Telegram bot. The link is in the description. That's all for today. Thank you for watching.